Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Sunday, the 15th of February 2015. We're going to have the outsiders, but I don't know whether there'll be any first dog on the moon today because there's been some kind of a terrorist attack in Denmark, and the radio's going on about that.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not. And self-introduced to the Sunday Extra studios this morning, Eva Cox, sociologist, activist, feminist commentator, Chris Berg, senior fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, and Toby Ralph, marketing, strategy, and communications genius. Welcome to you all.
Here's that money again, Tom.
Thank you, Toby. Just a little extra in my meagre stipend. Eva Cox, good government began in this past week. How's that going for you?
Didn't notice. A mixture before. I mean, what was there to notice? In fact, I think we had some very good examples of bad government that came after that, quite apart from the fact we worry about what came beforehand.
Yes.
But I think an attitude from the Prime Minister, which basically said he was good at bashing up the Labour Party, but wasn't, not good at bashing up the Liberal Party, was hardly the sort of thing that you'd expect from good leadership.
This is what occurred to me too, Chris Berg, that I thought there would be challenges on the plate of the Australian Prime Minister at this point in our life as a nation and an economy, which were of greater significance than just being able to put down Bill Shorten.
Well, look, one of the issues that the government is going to have over the next little while, and Tony Abbott specifically is going to have, is resetting the direction of the government, given that the last year's agenda, or a large part of last year's agenda, has been stymied in the Senate or abandoned by the government and so forth. And so we're coming up to this unholy deadline of May and the next budget. And what is that going to look like? Because it's very, very unclear what it is going to look like unless it's just a steady as she goes, watch the revenue and watch the surplus and watch the deficit decline.
Which would let us down somewhat if that's all it was, is it?
Well, yeah, look, this was always the biggest challenge for the government, getting the budget into surplus, or getting the budget on the right track. It is the hardest thing for them to do. It's much harder than repealing the carbon tax, and even much harder than stopping the boats, if that's all you want to do. It is a whole of government problem, and it goes to the heart of any government.
But isn't one of the problems of the thing is that they're being oversimplistic, because they're banging on so interminably about the surplus that they don't recognise, or the deficit and the surplus, they don't recognise that having a good deficit is different from having a bad deficit, and having good expenditure is different from having bad expenditure. We just get this simplistic rant about the fact we've got to cut government spending full stop, which they've got into trouble for doing. So
I haven't talked about the deficit for a while now.
Well, yes, they keep carrying on about the fact that we're spending too much money, but they don't distinguish between those things that we need to spend and those things we don't need to spend, apart from the fact they keep sort of pulling out these really bizarre proposals to cut things which the public is saying, thank you very much, we don't want those cut.
And Toby, we might not have the spectacle now, as Chris says, it's a big budget, but we have a Prime Minister who's wounded, and a Treasurer who's trying to make his reputation as a financial manager, and the two of them are going to collide, I suspect, in terms of intentions in the budget process.
I do think they do. I mean, Tony Abbott's been through what you'd call a non-competitive evaluation process so far this week.
The Liberal leadership has been subjected to a competitive evaluation process.
Well, it has. I mean, look, if 60% of my colleagues got together and decided I was competent enough to continue, I'd be astonished. But that's one of
That's why you never call those meetings.
I just stay out of the room, I think.
But you don't have a tied vote, do you?
No, but no, Hockey and Abbott are on a collision course, and it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be pretty at all.
No. However, to the Prime Minister's credit, he did have the courage, I think would be the word, to chat with Lee Sales this week.
We've had the Tony Abbott in opposition, the guy who promised no more chaos, the adults back in charge, there'd be no excuses, no broken promises. Then there's the Tony Abbott that we've had so far in government with the surprise policies and the broken promises and the captain's picks. Now you're offering us a third Tony Abbott, one who's going to change. Who are you?
Well, Lee, let's just focus for a second on the captain's picks. There have essentially been two captain's picks.
Can we actually just focus on the big picture there? Because there's been three different Tony Abbotts. I just want to know, which one are you? Who are you?
Well, Lee, I will let the Australian people form their own conclusions.
I think Eva Cox, Paul Lee Sales was just seconds away there from getting the full Mark Riley from.
Yes, well, I mean, he doesn't like being asked to explain anything, does he? He really doesn't, you know. Yes.
But what a question, Toby Ralph. If a Prime Minister can be asked on national television, who are you? I suspect we're in a tricky pass.
Yes, who were you? I think might have been the more relevant question. What is that rudeness or is that good journalism? I think it's good journalism. I think it's very brave.
It's often very, very, very hard to tell them apart.
Yeah, well, indeed. But I think she was saying what a lot of people are thinking.
I think I have a problem with the question because I think it's an absolute nonsense question. Because if you were asked to answer, who are you? I don't know, the Prime Minister of Australia, I guess. The real essential point that I think Lee Sales was trying to get at is what is the government's story, not who are you, because that just makes it about Tony Abbott. The problem that the government has is what is the story going into the next couple of months? What is the story eventually going into the next election? What is the narrative of the government? Not who.
But isn't the problem that Tony Abbott has made himself the story? It's all about I. It's never about we, and it's always about him and his particular pugilistic type views, rather than talking about the government. He doesn't talk about his government. He talks about himself.
Well, possibly that's the issue, that as far as he's concerned, he is the issue, because the big politics that's now being played in his terms is his survival. Toby, you...
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, he's surviving through submarine contracts and who knows what. Abbott's problem has always been he's been strong in opposition, and he's built a machinery to oppose things. And he's brought that into government. So I've always been clear on what he stood against, but I've never really been clear on what the government stood for. So he's yet to build some kind of sturdy narrative about his vision for Australia and the government's vision for Australia. I think the trick of leadership is not to have an idea, but it's to unite people behind that idea and get them to accept it to a point that they'll say reluctantly, okay, when you do some tough things, to move toward that idea.
I mean, that was the thing about the budget last year, and there's been some commentary, Chris Berg, around this, that in the Costello kind of mould, that was the opportunity to really, nail the colours to the mast and do something which was so determinedly tough that suited the times. And in our cycle, the opportunity's gone, never mind the confusion that we have now around internal power play.
Yeah, that's probably right, and that's worryingly right. And one of the reasons that I think they should have, both governments, both the Labor and the Liberal government, should have strived to get into surplus really, really quickly, is once you miss these windows of opportunity, then the economy might turn further.
Or even if not to worry about surplus, but to worry about some of the structural problems.
You worry about the structural, but you have to worry about the health of the budget, because you cannot do all the grand social policies. You cannot do, if you want to do counter-cyclical fiscal policy, unless the budget is in a reasonably healthy surplus.
Well, I think that. I mean, but surely that's the problem that they've got into. They bang on interminably about the budget. They tried to cut things which really offended people, and they go on and on and on about it. And if you can say one thing about the elections in Victoria, Queensland, the attitude to the Commonwealth stuff is voters are indicating that they are bored shitless about the budget. They actually do not want to hear about the budget, so they're not going to actually engage with more and more boring debates about the surplus.
You can make aggressive cuts. It is possible to make aggressive and
not unless you get the people,
and unpopular cuts.
Not unless you get the people with you.
The problem that the government has had so far is it failed to build the narrative leading up to the May budget. Suddenly threw half a dozen policies at the same time, and then failed to get them through the Senate.
Because they were bad policies, and people didn't like them.
But occasionally Parliament passes bad policies, and quite successfully.
But they usually don't pass bad policies that the public actually has noticed are bad policies to that degree.
Can I switch just briefly here? And this is Outsiders on Sunday Extra. Eva Cox, Chris Berg, and Toby Ralph. And Toby, to you first on this one. Well, I thought so much has happened. A week is a long time in politics, is the saw, and last week proved that to a fault. And in such a crowded environment, a thing that cut through to me in an incredibly saddening way was the response to the Human Rights Commission report.
Yes.
That we had here a report which is basically saying, yes, the number of kids in detention has been cut dramatically. Great. we have more than 200 currently in detention. They are self-harming. They may be facing the prospect of significant lifelong psychological harm. It is being done on our watch. And the response is to simply attack in the most strident way the person who wrote the report.
Yes, indeed. There was an attack on Triggs, and there was an attack on, basically Abbott's response was, why weren't you attacking the Labor Party when they had far more people in detention, far more kids in detention during their period? Why weren't you doing something during their watch? So he politicised it because he seems to be looking at everything through the prism of political opportunity and political danger, and perhaps good government needs to elevate itself above that.
Are we, Eva Cox, just morally adrift now?
Well, I think so, because I think the attack on Gillian Trigg was particularly noxious because it actually left these kids sort of sitting there being unlooked at while he slung off at her and the Labor Party. I mean, there is no evidence that she's an ALP lovey, as one of the papers described her. She is an incredibly straight lawyer who is trying to do the right thing, and attacking her and leaving behind the whole issue of children in detention, which is something that really we do need to address, just actually shows that this government has become sort of bereft of any sort of principle. And that's one of the reasons I was saying earlier, they can't get policies across because nobody trusts them to have the goodwill, the goodwill towards the community. We've got a trust deficit, which is much more important in some ways than a financial deficit.
Or do we, Chris Berger, as a country, as people, just not care that kids in Nauru, I think it's the Saturday paper editorial put it yesterday, are the heads on the pikes on our border to deter further arrivals? Are we happy now with that situation?
No, I don't think anybody is happy with that situation. I don't think anybody in the government is happy with that situation either. I think one of their, this was a strategic or tactical mistake by Tony Abbott and the rest of the government to claim that it was a political attack. Now, there were political elements in the timing of this report, and Gillian Triggs admitted as such in a Senate committee hearing some months back,
which did not flatter her, and
which did not flatter her.
No.
But the government has, under its own argument on stopping the boats, a good story to tell about the fact that there are fewer children in detention. Now, we can all have our own personal views on whether stopping the boats is the sole purpose of public policy, but the government had a good story to tell, and I don't think anybody's particularly happy with children still being in detention. I think the purpose of the policy that the government has set up is so that there will be fewer children in detention and ultimately no children in detention. Why Tony Abbott didn't tell that story, why he decided that I'm going to go, everything to the wall against Gillian Triggs and the Human Rights Commission, I'm not sure.
Is that because it's too internal, Toby Ralph? Because the logic there is all about your internal political frame. It's not actually taking into account external observable evidence.
Well, I suspect it's about failures in the office, quite honestly. They're not getting the message right. If you think back to John Howard's office, there's always a conflict between politics and policy, and then how that flows into media. So in Howard's office, we had Arthur Sinodinos running policies as a final check, final filter before it got through to Howard. Then you had Tony Nutt, authorised by A Nutt for the Liberal Party of Canberra.
Happier times.
Checking the political ramifications, and then you had Tony O'Leary, looking at the media side. But Arthur and Tony would have the arguments about policy.
More of Tony Ralph squaring off.
Oh, no, they're good people. You'd have those people having that debate before it got to the Prime Minister. You've got an office now where policy and politics and media are the decision of one person, and there's insufficient conflict there, I suspect, to get balanced views and proper strategy.
I'll tell you what it all adds up to.
Tell me.
Good government. Thank you to our outsiders this morning. They've been Eva Cox, sociologist, activist, feminist commentator, Chris Berg as well, senior fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, and Toby Ralph, marketing strategy communications consultant. We will outsider again next week here on Sunday Extra, and that, I'm afraid, is it for us.
And I'm afraid there's no first dog on the moon this week because of an apparent terrorist attack in Denmark.